Generative AI is here, and it has changed the rules of the game. Experts like Seth Godin and Robert McKee have been very clear. The authors who are going to make it in this business are those who are writing truly amazing, knock your socks off innovative stories. The bar is that high. AI will replace mediocre writers. But at some point, everybody is mediocre. So what do? You educate yourself. And the good news is that there's still time, but you've got to start leveling up right away. I'm Valerie Francis, and I've got a series of webinars to help you do just that. My specialty is helping authors like you put theory into practice. Understanding the tools of our trade and being able to apply them with precision is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity. So go to valeriefrancis.ca/webinars for more information and sign up for the notifications. You can't afford not to.
If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 6 and discuss what we've learned about empathy and stakes. Well, we'd really love it if you could give our show a rating and review. And for Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. Right, Valerie, why don't you start off by telling us what your big aha moments were with respect to empathy?
Well, empathy is a must. There are few, if any, rules when it comes to storytelling, but the idea that a writer has to create a protagonist that the reader empathizes with is about as close to a rule as it's possible to be. Now, I'm sure there's an exception to this out there somewhere, but if you're a new writer working on one of your first half dozen books, yes, I do honestly mean your first half dozen books, and you don't yet have a solid, loyal, and large fan base, creating a protagonist that no one empathizes with is not a winning strategy. Now, it's understood here that I'm referring to a reader who is a fan of the genre. Art is subjective in nature, so even a brilliantly crafted story isn't for everyone, and that's okay. In fact, if you know anything about marketing, that's preferable. So, for example, Melanie, you didn't empathize with Michael Corleone in The Godfather, but that doesn't mean that nobody does. In fact, millions of people do, and have for 50 years. All it means is that this form of art isn't your thing. Cool. The other assumption I'm making here is that we're talking to writers who want to publish their books and who want people to read the books. If you're writing a novel that you intend to put in your drawer and never show anyone, then it really doesn't matter if anyone, including you, empathizes with your main character. For everyone else, it's one of the most important considerations. And remember, empathy is not sympathy. I want to repeat something I said in As Good as It Gets, which is episode 5 of this season. For some reason, writers seem fixated on this issue of likability. I want to say this very clearly, and I want everyone to pay attention. Forget about likability. Likability is irrelevant because it's boring. Readers and moviegoers use the term all the time. They say they like or they love a character. And writers have translated this to mean a character who is nice or inoffensive. That is wrong. What it means is that the character is fascinating. Fascination is what we're after, not likability. And we're fascinated by characters who have layers and dimensions. Now, that's exactly what I'll be studying next season, but for now, let me continue with empathy. Over the course of the last 10 episodes, I talked about a few different ways to generate empathy, including establishing a clear object of desire, which has with it a clear motivation. Empathy can be created through a shared experience between the character and the reader. I discussed this at length in The Wife, but I've been giving this a lot of thought since that episode, and I want to add something to it. I don't think I brought it out well enough in the episode, so I want to spend another minute on it here. A shared experience, whether it's the entire story or just one part of a story, I think works great as a hook. It's really going to grab the attention of readers who have had that same experience. But it isn't enough to carry a whole story, because otherwise your story is not going to resonate with anyone who hasn't had exactly that same experience. What we've got to consider is the emotion that the experience has created. For example, I have never been married to a man who has won a Nobel Prize for books that I have written. However, I've certainly experienced times when my contribution to a project has been overlooked. I've had men, bosses, and colleagues pass my hard work off as their own. I've also had women do it to me, so it's not a gender thing. So, although the opening scene in The Wife caught my attention, because I've been there, I tell you that, the plot of the rest of the story is not something I have experience with. But the way Jean feels as a result of the plot, that I do have experience with. And that is what I empathized with in the course of the rest of the story. So, yes, a shared experience will work, but it's got to be coupled with a shared emotion. And of the two, I think a shared emotional experience is the more important or the more powerful. Now, we've also got to consider the importance of environment on a character. Just like we are the products of our own environment, our fictional characters are products of their own fictional environments. So, as we develop our characters, we've got to be mindful of the world that they live in and how it has shaped their thoughts, their beliefs, their attitudes. Because these are the things that will be revealed through the character's actions. These are the things that ground a character's actions and make them make sense. They make them ring true for us. We can also bounce on to empathy via another emotion such as pity. Another idea is considering the type of protagonist that we're creating. There are 4 types of protagonist, and I talked about those in episode 1, The King's Speech. So go listen to that for more information. And then we've got to create a force of antagonism that is so great, it doesn't seem that the protagonist could ever possibly triumph. Finally, or at least the last idea that I've mentioned in this season, we've got to consider the genre we're writing in. Because the degree of empathy you create, how heavily you lean into it, and whether you also need to create empathy with other characters, for example, depends on the point of the story and what the reader is coming to the story for and coming to that particular genre for. When we decide to watch Manchester by the Sea, we're looking for a very different experience than the one we're after when we choose to watch Operation Mincemeat. So, that's a lot, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. So that's my thoughts on empathy for this season. Melanie, how about you?
Well, when I started this season and I was listening to you talk about empathy, I was wondering, would there be an overlap between empathy and resonance, which is the topic that I studied in season 5. And I actually came to realise, well, that empathy is a subset of resonance, right? This is how I have categorised that in my mind, and it makes sense to me that empathy sits within the resonance framework. Now, if that doesn't work for you, then that's okay, but that is very much how I have come to view empathy as something that we can view when we think about resonance throughout a whole story. Now, the biggest aha moment this season came for me when we watched 10 Things I Hate About You. And this was the moment when I could see why empathy is so important to a story, because I started to understand what happens when there is no empathy between the reader and the characters. And so basically, there was no reason to keep reading or watching. Now, the only reason I kept watching 10 Things was because I had to for the podcast. But there were also other examples this season where I didn't empathise with the characters as much as I expected to. I thought I was going to have more empathy for Nancy in Good Luck to You, Leo Grand. But the intensity of the two people in a room scenario meant the writers had to keep conflict going in a way that decreased my empathy with Nancy. And that was particularly when she started to shame Leo by taking on a motherly role with him, and when she started to ask him questions about his mother. So between 10 Things and Leo Grand, I believe we went from having no character to empathise with to a situation where the conflict was forced, and it inadvertently created moments when my empathy shifted. Now, this made me reflect on the point that Valerie made, that empathy isn't something you establish and then forget about. It is something that has to be maintained through the story. And with this in mind, we had some great examples with The Wife, The King's Speech, and Manchester by the Sea. Now, these are master classes in how to establish empathy and maintain it over the course of a long format movie. And the common thread in these three movies is how the writers focused on a specific aspect of the human condition in each of the protagonists. For Joan, that was sacrificing her needs to meet Joe's. For Bertie, it was the requirement to live a public life with a crippling impediment. And for Lee, it was his inconsolable guilt. So, Valerie, what's your best advice to take away for writers when it comes to empathy this season?
Well, it's this: take the time to create a protagonist that the reader can empathize with. If you don't, all the other time and energy and effort and money that you're putting into writing your novel and promoting your novel will be wasted. An agent's not going to sign you, a publisher won't publish you. And if you indie publish, which is totally valid and in many cases the smart option, the readers aren't going to read your work. And what did we learn from The Wife? A writer must be read. All right, Melanie, this season you studied stakes. So what did you discover?
Well, what fascinated me this season is how the stakes are presented and when they are presented in movies. So until I focused on stakes this season, I had assumed that the best thing to do was to establish what's at stake for a character in the beginning hook of the story. However, what I've realised is that how stakes are communicated to the reader can depend on the type of story you're writing. So in The Wife, which is an internal genre or mini-plot story, we realise what's at stake via the object of desire at the end of the story, and this makes sense because that's the type of story that's being told. So we need to travel on this journey with Joan to have the insight and to have her rage simmer silently through her facial expressions and her words. For The King's Speech, which is a performance story, the object of desire is going to be there from the very beginning. So we see it up front in the first scene. And I think that that's really important for that type of story. With Manchester by the Sea, however, and The Wife reveal their stakes in a very similar way. And I really think that's because they are mini-plot stories. And then in The Godfather, which is a society political story with a strong internal genre for the primary protagonist, the object of desire, the complications and the consequences of those complications are key to understanding the fall and the rise of the Corleones and the price the other mafia families have to pay. Now, the change to Michael's object of desire halfway through is also essential to understanding what's at stake for him and why his actions change. But I was also surprised to learn that stakes can change through the story, like I just mentioned with The Godfather. And it was also clear to me this season that what's at stake is linked to the objects of desire for a character. And there is no way of getting away from this. Again, 10 Things I Hate About You was an example of what not to do. Where the two main characters, Kat and Patrick, didn't really have objects of desire, and that results in no significant consequences if they do or don't get what they want. And, there was really nothing at stake for either of these characters, which meant our care factor was pretty low or non-existent. So what were your aha moments, Valerie?
Well, I really like the equation you came up with. Object of desire plus consequences equals stakes. And what I like about it is that it highlights the fact that stakes isn't a storytelling principle in and of itself. Like empathy and narrative drive, it's an effect that is created when other storytelling principles work together. Now, there aren't that many storytelling principles. There really aren't. I mean, how many times, Melanie, have we talked about object of desire? Hundreds, if not thousands. And yet, when we sit down to write a book or we write a scene, we do it so often without any idea of what the protagonist wants. That one principle impacts all kinds of other things, including stakes, including empathy, including narrative drive. So, to me, Melanie, your work this season has really underscored the importance for writers to learn the basic principles of storytelling, not just learn them intellectually. That's not hard. An object of desire is what a character wants and needs. There, that's the intellectual understanding of the theory. But what we've got to do is take the time to study other stories to see that principle in action. What does Lee in Manchester by the Sea want? What does Jean in The Wife want? What does Wally want? What does Bertie want? These wants, these objects of desire, are the guiding light for the entire story. If you don't know what your main character wants, you'll never be able to establish the stakes in your story, and you'll never be able to generate empathy.
Yeah, they're really, really good points, Valerie. And I think I've come to that, I've come to that same conclusion myself. So I started this season and I tried to look at states through a risks, issues, and opportunities framework. Now, I've been a project manager and a planner, and that was part of my role, right? And this framework made sense to me. So, along with that, I also understand how likelihood and consequences also impact risks and opportunities. And like Valerie mentioned, I proposed the equation that stakes equals the objects of desire and the consequences and likelihood of the events that occur over time. And that's probably a pretty good shorthand description, I think, and lends itself to understanding the very simple theory that Valerie has just put forward. But I have to admit that I think the description I first proposed in episode 4, which was The Wife, is my preferred way of describing stakes. And so I'm going to repeat it again. The object of desire is what's at stake for a character. It's what they have to lose or what they gain. But what happens through a story is a series of progressive complications that are risk events or opportunities along the spectrum of possible events that will either move the character closer to or further away from their object of desire. These risk events and opportunities have likelihoods and consequences. And when writers raise the stakes, what's really meant is that the writers increase the severity of the consequences of the complications, and we increase the likelihood of those consequences impacting the character's ability to obtain their object of desire. And the thing we both agree on is that objects of desire are essential in establishing what's at stake in a story. And it's perfectly okay for the objects of desire to change as the story progresses, depending on the type of story that you're writing.
Alrighty, Melanie, what have you got on tap for season 7?
Well, next season I'm going to study world building, and to challenge myself, I'm going to steer away from fantasy and science fiction stories. What about you, Valerie?
Well, as I teased a few minutes ago, next season I'm going to study character development, and character revelation. It's going to be a good one, so be there or be square.
All right. Well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Ray. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/innercircle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to get my tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.